5 flights, 5 moments when the sky turned deadly. Japan Airlines 123, 520 souls fighting a doomed jet. Delta 191 ripped from the sky by an invisible storm. Aeromexico 498, 2 planes colliding in perfect weather. US Air 1493, a runway turned into fire. Aloha 243, a roof torn off at 24,000 feet. They were routine flights until the unthinkable happened. And from their wreckage came the rules that keep us safe today. Because every crash tells a story, and every story was paid for in blood. It was a warm August evening in Japan. The year was 1985, a time when Japan Airlines stood as a symbol of national pride, its red crane emblem recognized across the world. At Tokyo's Haneda Airport, hundreds of passengers prepared for a short domestic flight north to Osaka. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747SR, would make the trip in less than an hour. It was supposed to be routine, just another summer evening in the skies. Among the 524 people boarding the flight were families, businessmen, and children returning from vacations. There was a sense of calm in the terminal, no hint that within hours, the flight would become a national tragedy. At 6:12 p.m., the crew of Flight 123 pushed back from the gate. Captain Masami Takahama, an experienced pilot with over 12,000 flight hours, sat in command. To his right was First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and behind them, Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda. The aircraft, a Boeing 747SR-46, was designed for short-range, high-density routes within Japan. Its 4 engines roared to life as it taxied toward runway 15. At 6:24 p.m., air traffic control cleared Flight 123 for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the golden evening sky. Everything appeared normal. Passengers relaxed. Some gazed out the windows as the lights of Tokyo faded below. In the cockpit, the crew began their climb toward cruising altitude, but just 12 minutes after takeoff, disaster struck. A sudden loud bang echoed through the cabin. The entire aircraft shuddered violently. The crew felt an explosive decompression. The air pressure inside the plane dropped instantly. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling as the aircraft began to tremble uncontrollably. In the cockpit, warning alarms blared. The crew had no idea what had happened, only that the plane was rapidly losing control. Unknown to them, the rear pressure bulkhead, a large metal wall sealing the tail section, had ruptured catastrophically. 7 years earlier, the aircraft had suffered a tail strike incident and was repaired by Boeing. But that repair had been done incorrectly, a single row of rivets instead of 2. Over years of pressurization cycles, tiny cracks grew until the metal finally failed. When the bulkhead burst, it tore away a large portion of the tail and severed all 4 hydraulic lines. The Boeing 747 instantly lost its ability to control the elevators, rudder, and ailerons, the very systems that keep an aircraft stable. The crew was now flying an uncontrollable jet. Inside the cabin, passengers screamed as oxygen masks dangled and the aircraft began to oscillate. It pitched up, then down, rolling side to side like a wounded bird. The noise was deafening, a mixture of rushing wind, alarms, and the roar of engines. The crew fought desperately to keep the jet stable using only engine power. By throttling the left and right engines separately, they could make the aircraft bank or climb slightly. But it was almost impossible to control. At 6:27 p.m., Captain Takahama radioed Tokyo Control. Request immediate return to Haneda, uncontrollable. His voice was calm but strained. The controller asked for clarification. Uncontrollable? Yes, Takahama repeated. We are unable to control. Air traffic control cleared the skies for Flight 123, giving it priority. On radar, controllers watched in confusion as the Boeing 747 began flying erratically, climbing, descending, and turning in wide circles over central Japan. For the next 32 minutes, the crippled jumbo jet remained airborne, its crew struggling against impossible odds. In the passenger cabin, the situation was dire. The rapid decompression had filled the plane with fog-like mist. Many passengers wrote farewell notes to loved ones on slips of paper, wallets, and tissues. Some prayed. Others held hands. One note found later read simply, "Please take care of the children. I am so sorry." In the cockpit, The three men fought continuously to keep the jet from rolling over. The aircraft's nose pitched down violently, and the crew managed to recover only by adjusting engine thrust, a crude and exhausting method. Their instruments were erratic, the warning lights constant. Every minute felt like an hour. At one point, the plane briefly climbed above 24,000 feet, then descended rapidly. The cabin pressure fluctuated wildly, making it nearly impossible for the crew to communicate. Their oxygen masks hung loose. Sweat dripped from their faces as they fought the yoke that no longer responded. At 6:40 p.m., U.S. military radar at Yokota Air Base detected the erratic flight path. American air controllers, realizing the danger, offered assistance and prepared to guide the crippled aircraft to their base. But the Japanese crew, following their own ATC instructions, attempted to head for Tokyo. Confusion grew. The Boeing 747, now severely unstable, began another uncontrolled descent. Passengers screamed as the aircraft plunged thousands of feet, then suddenly pitched upward again. In the cockpit, alarms blared. Overspeed, stall, altitude warnings all at once. The flight engineer called out readings, trying to keep the captain informed. But every control input produced only chaos. They were flying a 400,000-kilogram aircraft with no hydraulics, a near impossibility. At 6:56 p.m., 32 minutes after the initial explosion, the aircraft descended through a layer of cloud over the mountains of Gunma Prefecture. Below them, the rugged terrain of Mount Osutaka stretched in darkness. The last radio transmission came. Seconds later, a desperate, fragmented call. "We're going down, uncontrolled." At 6:57 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 slammed into a ridge near Mount Takamagahara. The impact tore the massive jet apart, scattering debris and fire across the mountain forest. The sound echoed for miles. All 524 souls on board were engulfed in the inferno. Miraculously, 4 passengers, all women seated in the rear of the aircraft, survived the impact, found injured but alive the next day. Everyone else perished. Rescue operations were delayed, although U.S. forces at Yokota Air Base detected the crash location quickly. Confusion over jurisdiction caused a devastating delay. Japanese rescue teams did not reach the site until the next morning, nearly 12 hours later. By then, many who might have survived the night had succumbed to their injuries. When daylight came, rescuers faced a horrific scene. The wreckage lay, strewn across the mountainside, wings, seats, and fragments of the red crane logo mixed with twisted metal. Personal belongings were scattered among the trees. The site was eerily silent, except for the hum of helicopters overhead. Japan was in shock. In Tokyo, news of the disaster spread rapidly. Families waiting at Osaka Airport wept as officials confirmed the aircraft was missing. Television stations interrupted programming with breaking news bulletins. As night fell, millions of Japanese citizens stayed awake, praying for survivors. But by morning, the full scale of the tragedy was clear. The investigation that followed revealed the horrifying truth. The rear pressure bulkhead, improperly repaired years earlier after a tail strike, had failed due to metal fatigue. The single row of rivets used in the 1978 repair allowed cracks to grow each time the aircraft was pressurized. Boeing engineers confirmed that the repair did not meet design standards. When the bulkhead finally ruptured, it blew off the vertical stabilizer and destroyed all 4 hydraulic lines, the lifeblood of the aircraft's control system. With no hydraulics, the 747 became virtually uncontrollable. Only engine thrust changes could alter its flight path, but those responses were delayed and unstable. The crew's extraordinary efforts had kept the aircraft airborne for more than half an hour, an almost superhuman feat. Investigators later praised Captain Takahama and his crew for their skill and courage. Boeing issued new global inspection orders. Airlines around the world examined pressure bulkheads on their fleets, and maintenance procedures were rewritten to prevent similar mistakes. It was one of aviation's darkest lessons, learned at a terrible cost. For Japan, the loss was unbearable. 520 lives were gone. Parents, children, entire families. Among them was Kyu Sakamoto, a beloved singer known for the global hit Sukiyaki. His death added a haunting cultural dimension to the tragedy. Across Japan, people mourned not Only the victims, but the sense of national safety they had once taken for granted. The crash site on Mount Osutaka became a sacred place. Every year, families of the victims climbed the mountain to pay their respects, leaving flowers and letters where their loved ones died. Even decades later, the memory of Flight 123 lingers, a wound that never fully healed. In aviation history, the disaster reshaped how airlines and manufacturers approached maintenance, safety, and emergency preparedness. Boeing re-examined its repair oversight processes, and Japan Airlines overhauled its maintenance culture. The accident also led to new simulator training for pilots, teaching them how to control an aircraft with partial or total hydraulic failure. For investigators, the final report was both a revelation and a heartbreak. The chain of failure began not in the sky, but years earlier on the ground, with a single flawed repair. It was a tragic reminder that in aviation, every detail matters, and even the smallest oversight can cost hundreds of lives. For the families left behind, the technical explanation could not fill the void. Letters recovered from the wreckage painted a portrait of human loss. Fathers writing to their children, mothers whispering final goodbyes. In one haunting recording, a passenger's tape captured the final moments, calm voices praying as the aircraft trembled in its final descent. Japan Airlines Flight 123 became more than a disaster. It became a symbol of courage, of human error, and of the relentless pursuit of safety that followed. From its ashes came reforms that have since saved countless lives. Yet for those who remember that August evening, the pain remains as vivid as ever. In the end, it was not weather, nor terrorism, nor war that brought down the Great Red Crane, but a mistake buried deep within metal and memory. And in that realization, aviation changed forever. It was midsummer in 1985. Across the world, international air travel was booming. Among the busiest routes was Air India's transatlantic service from Canada to India, carrying families, students, and business travelers between continents. On the evening of June 22, 1985, at Montreal's Mirabel Airport, a gleaming Boeing 747-237B stood ready for departure. Its name was Kanishka, after an ancient Indian emperor, a symbol of pride for Air India. Flight 182 would fly from Montreal to London, then onward to Delhi and Bombay. For the 329 souls on board, it was an ordinary night. For the world of aviation, it would become a nightmare. Inside the terminal, passengers queued calmly, parents with sleepy children, young couples starting new lives, students heading home for summer break. The aircraft's 4 Rolls-Royce engines gleamed under the floodlights. Captain H.S. Narendra was in command, a respected pilot with thousands of hours of international flying experience. He was joined by First Officer SSS Aluwalia and a seasoned crew. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. At 8:15 p.m. local time, Flight 182 pushed back and began taxiing. Controllers cleared the giant 747 for takeoff. The aircraft accelerated down the runway, lifted into the night sky, and banked east toward the Atlantic. Passengers settled in for the overnight flight to London. Cabin lights dimmed, meal trays clinked softly, and the ocean below disappeared into darkness. But far from Montreal, 2 other pieces of luggage had already begun their journey. Bags checked in at Vancouver and Toronto under false names. Inside each was a powerful bomb, built with a barometric trigger designed to explode at high altitude. The plot was the work of Sikh extremists seeking revenge for the Indian Army's 1984 assault on the Golden Temple in Amritsar. Air India, as the national carrier, had become their target. As the Kanishka crossed the Atlantic, no one on board had any idea that a deadly device was hidden deep in the forward cargo hold. At 7:14 a.m. Irish time, the aircraft cruised smoothly at 31,000 feet. Radio contact with air traffic control in Shannon, Ireland, was routine. The crew reported no issues. Then, without warning, the radio went silent. At 7:15 a.m., radar controllers saw Flight 182's signal flicker, then vanish completely. A few seconds later, a flash of light appeared on civilian radar screens, followed by countless smaller blips. Over the North Atlantic, 190 kilometers southwest of Ireland, Air India Flight 182 had disintegrated in midair. In the fishing village of Ahakista on Ireland's southern coast, Locals heard a deep rumble that rolled across the morning sky. Fishermen out at sea saw a bright explosion high above the clouds, then falling debris, pieces of fuselage, luggage, and bodies descending into the ocean. Within minutes, the calm Atlantic was covered with floating wreckage, the world's worst act of aviation terrorism until September 11, 2001, had just occurred. Rescue centers in Ireland and Britain scrambled. Helicopters and naval ships rushed to the coordinates, hoping for survivors. But there were none. All 329 aboard, 268 Canadian citizens, 27 Britons, and 24 Indians, had been killed instantly. The debris field stretched for miles, marked by fuel slicks and drifting bodies. Search teams recovered passports, toys, torn life vests, and the aircraft's orange tail section bobbing in the waves. As news broke, confusion reigned. Air India's London office initially believed the aircraft had suffered a radio failure. But when another bomb exploded almost simultaneously at Tokyo's Narita airport, inside baggage bound for a second Air India flight, investigators realized the unthinkable. Both incidents were linked. The bombs had been checked in on Canadian soil. One had detonated prematurely in Tokyo, killing 2 baggage handlers. The other had destroyed Flight 182 over the Atlantic. Families gathered in airports across the world, London, Toronto, Delhi, waiting for updates that would never come. In Toronto, distraught relatives clung to each other as lists of names were read. In India, television news interrupted morning broadcasts. The nation went silent. It was not just an accident. It was mass murder in the sky. As ships recovered wreckage, investigators from Canada, Ireland, and India joined forces. The flight data and cockpit voice recorders were recovered from a depth of over 6,700 feet. They confirmed that the explosion occurred in the forward cargo compartment at 7:14:01 a.m. The sudden rupture blew open the fuselage, separated the nose from the rest of the aircraft, and caused an immediate decompression. The cockpit voice recorder captured only a single brief sound, a loud thump followed by static. The entire aircraft broke apart within seconds. In Ottawa, the Canadian government faced pressure. How could terrorists have planted a bomb on an international flight departing from Canadian airports? The investigation traced the luggage back to Vancouver, where it had been checked onto a connecting flight to Toronto and then transferred to Air India 182, all without its supposed passenger ever boarding. Security procedures at the time did not require matching bags with passengers, a loophole the bombers exploited. The RCMP and the Canadian Security Intelligence Service soon identified a network of Sikh extremists operating in British Columbia, followers of militant leader Talwinder Singh Parmar. Their goal, to punish India for Operation Blue Star. The plan had been simple: 2 bombs, 2 Air India flights. Only one succeeded. As weeks passed, the ocean gave up its secrets. Divers recovered bodies still strapped in seats, oxygen masks frozen in their grasp. Among the dead were entire families, including 82 children. The youngest victim was just 8 months old. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed parts of the aircraft in a hangar in Ireland, examining blast patterns and metal fragments. Forensic tests confirmed traces of high explosives consistent with dynamite and RDX. The horror shook the world. It was the deadliest terrorist attack involving a civilian aircraft before 9/11, and the largest mass murder in Canadian history. Yet the search for justice would prove agonizingly slow. Years turned into decades of trials, mistrials, and political controversy. Only one man, Inderjeet Singh Rayat, was eventually convicted, not for murder, but for manslaughter and perjury. Most of those responsible were never brought to justice. For the families, grief turned into a lifelong wound. In Canada's Indian communities, memorial services were held in temples, churches, and parks. Parents clutched photographs of lost sons and daughters. A mother in Toronto said softly to a reporter, "They went to see the world, and the world took them away." Back in India, Air India grounded flights for mourning. The airline's red and white logo, once a symbol of national confidence, became a reminder of tragedy. The crash forced governments to confront global airline security in a new way. Passenger baggage reconciliation, matching each bag to a confirmed traveler. became mandatory across major carriers. Explosive detection equipment was introduced in airports worldwide. Intelligence agencies began sharing data more closely, attempting to stop terrorism before it reached the tarmac. For investigators, Flight 182 represented a turning point. It was proof that terrorism could reach anywhere, even aboard a peaceful civilian flight far from any war zone. Aviation authorities rewrote safety manuals and airport screening became more stringent. The chain of complacency that had allowed the bomb to pass undetected was broken, but only after unimaginable loss. At sea, the Irish naval vessel Iceling recovered hundreds of bodies and fragments. Fishermen joined the search, pulling remains from nets. On June 24th, memorial services were held aboard the ships. The ocean was calm that day, the surface glittering under sunlight. Crew members stood in silence as wreaths of flowers drifted over the coordinates 51 and 31, the resting place of Flight 182. When the recovered bodies were flown home to Canada and India, thousands gathered along airport fences in silence. Coffins draped with Indian and Canadian flags were carried down the ramps. Priests chanted prayers. Children placed garlands of marigolds. The grief spanned oceans. Years later, survivors' families formed advocacy groups demanding accountability and recognition. They called the tragedy not just an act of terror, but a failure of governments to protect citizens. In 2005, on the 20th anniversary, Canada's Prime Minister formally apologized for the nation's failure to prevent the bombing, calling it a Canadian tragedy in every sense. Technically, the lessons of Flight 182 reshaped aviation security. Barometric-triggered bombs, once obscure, became a focus of international intelligence. Airlines began using sophisticated X-ray and chemical detection for checked luggage. The policy of no unaccompanied baggage became universal. The crash also prompted closer collaboration between nations in monitoring extremist threats, a system that remains in place today. Yet beyond the policies and reforms lay human stories, the unfinished lives of hundreds. Among the victims were entire generations, grandparents traveling with grandchildren, newlyweds, engineers, nurses, artists. For each of them, Flight 182 was not a symbol, it was simply a flight home. In Ahakista, Ireland, a memorial garden now overlooks the Atlantic. A sundial points toward the coordinates where the Kanishka fell. Its inscription reads, "Time flies, suns rise and shadows fall. Let it pass by. Love reigns forever over all." Every June, relatives gather there, placing flowers and speaking softly in the sea breeze. The Irish villagers who first saw the wreckage still attend, remembering that morning when the sky lit up with fire. For the aviation community, the tragedy remains a haunting reminder that safety is not only mechanical but human, built on vigilance, trust, and the will to learn from loss. Flight 182's passengers never knew their names would become part of history. Yet through them, the world learned the cost of neglecting the smallest warning signs. The Kanishka now rests beneath miles of cold Atlantic water, its story written in the memories of those left behind. Above the surface, airliners cross the same route every day, safer, watched, protected by systems born from that disaster. Each contrail that fades into the blue sky is a silent tribute to 329 lives, whose journey ended too soon. And for those who remember June 23, 1985, there remains a single truth, that even in the vastness of the ocean, loss leaves ripples that never disappear. The night was calm over the North Pacific. A gentle blue glow from the rising moon reflected off the ocean below as Korean Airlines Flight 007 lifted from Anchorage, Alaska, bound for Seoul. It was September 1st, 1983, a routine flight, carrying 269 passengers and crew. On board were families, tourists, diplomats, and a U.S. congressman. None of them could have imagined that within hours, their flight would vanish, shot down by a Soviet fighter jet, sparking one of the most dangerous confrontations of the Cold War. The Boeing 747 had begun its journey in New York earlier that day. After refueling in Anchorage, it would cross the Pacific to South Korea. Captain Chun Byung-in, an experienced pilot, commanded the flight. His co-pilot, First Officer Sun Dong-hui, handled navigation. The aircraft, tail number HL7442, was equipped with advanced inertial navigation systems, designed to guide it safely along its assigned route across open ocean. At 3 a.m. local time, Flight 007 took off from Anchorage's runway 32. Its engines roared in the night air as the massive jet climbed to cruising altitude. Passengers settled in for the long flight, over 5,000 miles across the Arctic seas. Children slept, flight attendants served late-night meals, and the hum of the cabin mixed with the soft glow of reading lights. But shortly after takeoff, a small error went unnoticed, one that would change everything. The crew's inertial navigation system had not been properly aligned. Instead of following its designated route R20, which curved southeast away from Soviet territory, the aircraft began drifting north, slowly but steadily, off course. At first, the deviation was slight, invisible against the endless expanse of water and cloud. But as hours passed, the gap widened. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, it was already several miles off track, heading directly toward Soviet airspace. At 3:50 a.m., radar operators in Alaska tracked the flight. Everything appeared normal. Across the Bering Sea, however, Soviet radar stations near Kamchatka detected an unidentified aircraft approaching their borders. The Cold War was at its height. Tension and mistrust defined every moment. To the Soviets, an unknown jet flying toward their territory could only mean one thing: a potential U.S. spy plane. Soviet air defense units scrambled fighter jets. 2 Sukhoi interceptors took off into the darkness, ordered to identify the intruder. On their radar, the Boeing 747 appeared large and slow, not like a military aircraft, but they couldn't take chances. They tried to make visual contact, but heavy clouds obscured the sky. Meanwhile, inside Flight 07, nothing seemed unusual. The crew chatted calmly, unaware of their mistake. The passengers were asleep, completely oblivious to the invisible border they had crossed, one of the most sensitive in the world. By 4 a.m., the jet entered Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula. Soviet anti-aircraft batteries prepared to engage, but the plane soon passed back over the sea, vanishing from radar. The interceptors returned to base. For a moment it seemed the danger had passed, but the aircraft continued its fateful drift, now heading toward Sakhalin Island, another restricted Soviet area. Once again, radar screens lit up. To Soviet commanders, this was no mistake. It looked deliberate. The order was given: intercept and, if necessary, destroy. At 3:56 UTC, 2 Sukhoi Su-15 fighters from Dolinsk Sokol Air Base were launched. One of them, flown by Major Gennady Osipovich, climbed through the night toward the radar target. As he approached, he saw lights, navigation beacons on the wings and fuselage of a large jetliner. Through the haze, it looked nothing like a spy plane, but Soviet command insisted it was an intruder. Osipovich radioed back: "Target identified visually. Resembles a civilian aircraft." The reply came cold and firm: "Destroy the target." At 3:26 a.m. Japanese time, Flight 07 crossed over Sakhalin Island, still unaware of what followed behind. In the cabin, passengers stirred as turbulence shook the plane. The crew began a slow climb to 35,000 feet. On the radar of the pursuing Soviet fighter, the range closed: 8 kilometers, then 5, then 2. Osipovich lined up his shot. He was ordered to fire warning bursts first. He switched on tracer rounds, bright red streaks designed to alert the aircraft, but no reaction came from the 747. In the cockpit of Kal 007, the crew probably never even saw them. They had no idea a Soviet fighter was flying behind them in the dark. At 3:28 a.m., the order came again: fire. 2 R-98 heat-seeking missiles launched from the Su-15. One missed. The other struck the tail of the Boeing 747. A flash of orange lit the night sky. The explosion ripped through the rear fuselage, destroying hydraulic systems and depressurizing the cabin. The aircraft lurched violently. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks fell. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. The crew struggled to regain control, unaware that their plane had been hit by a missile. For a few minutes, the aircraft remained airborne, descending in wide spirals. Witnesses on the ground later reported seeing fire streaking through the clouds, pieces breaking away. The Boeing 747 finally plunged into the Sea of Japan near Monaron Island. The impact shattered the aircraft completely. All 269 people aboard were killed. Among them was U.S. Congressman Larry McDonald on his way to Seoul for a conference. His death sent shockwaves through Washington. When news reached the world that a civilian airliner had been shot down by the Soviet Union, outrage followed instantly. The U.S. accused the Soviets of murdering innocent civilians. Moscow initially denied any involvement, claiming no aircraft had been near the area. But international radar evidence proved otherwise. Under pressure, the Soviets finally admitted to shooting down the jet, insisting it was a spy plane that had violated their airspace. In South Korea, grief turned to fury. Families demanded answers. At Seoul's Gimpo Airport, relatives waited in disbelief as officials read out the passenger list. There were no survivors. Memorials sprang up across the world, in Seoul, Washington, Tokyo, for the 269 lives lost. For days, Soviet ships patrolled the crash area, refusing access to U.S. and Japanese search teams. The black boxes were eventually recovered, secretly by Soviet divers, but not released for years. When the cockpit voice recorder was finally made public in 1993, it confirmed what investigators long suspected. The crew had no idea they had entered Soviet airspace. There were no military communications, no evasive maneuvers, only the normal chatter of a routine flight. The tragedy of Flight 07 shook the Cold War to its core. U.S. President Ronald Reagan condemned the attack as a massacre of innocent lives. Protests erupted around the world. Commercial airlines demanded tighter international airspace controls. The International Civil Aviation Organization launched a global review of navigation systems. One major result emerged directly from this disaster. The U.S. government decided to make its global positioning system, GPS, freely available for civilian use once completed. Never again would a commercial aircraft wander blindly into hostile territory. From the ashes of tragedy came a tool that would revolutionize global navigation. For the families, however, no technology could erase the loss. At memorials in Seoul and Anchorage, flowers were laid beside photographs, children, couples, and crew members smiling from another time. In Japan, fishermen who had seen the falling fireball still remembered the screams carried by the wind that night. The ocean had claimed them all. Years later, Russian officials finally released transcripts of the military communications. They revealed confusion and fear among the Soviet pilots, men following orders they barely understood. Major Osipovich later admitted in interviews that he regretted the attack, saying, "I saw the windows, I saw the lights. It didn't feel like war, it felt like murder." Today, the site where Flight 07 fell lies deep beneath the Sea of Japan. A monument stands in South Korea, its inscription reading, "May this tragedy never be repeated." The ocean around Monaran Island remains quiet, its waves passing endlessly over the unmarked graves of 269 souls. For aviation, the lesson was clear. Navigation errors, misunderstanding, and political tension can turn a simple mistake into global catastrophe. The crash of Flight 07 became a grim warning of what happens when human fear overrides communication, when radar blips replace faces, and compassion is lost in translation. As the years passed, the memory of that night faded from headlines, but not from history. Every time a modern jet crosses the Pacific safely, guided precisely by GPS, it flies in the shadow of Japan Airlines Flight 07, a flight that began in peace, strayed by chance, and ended in tragedy that changed the world. The skies over Texas were hot and heavy with summer storms. August 2, 1985, Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. In the late afternoon, thunderclouds built up over the plains, their dark shapes illuminated by flashes of distant lightning. On the ramp at Fort Lauderdale, Delta Airlines Flight 191, a wide-bodied Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, was preparing for departure. The flight was routine, 152 passengers and 11 crew bound for Dallas, then onward to Los Angeles. The crew was experienced. Captain Edward Connors had logged more than 29,000 hours in the air. First Officer Rudolph Price and Flight Engineer Nick Nasick worked alongside him, calm and professional as the TriStar's engines came to life. At 3:10 p.m., Flight 191 lifted off from Fort Lauderdale under clear skies, climbing smoothly toward cruising altitude. Passengers settled in for the 2-hour flight, business travelers, families, vacationers heading west. Flight attendants served drinks, children pressed faces to windows, and the calm hum of the engines filled the cabin. But hundreds of miles away, the weather over Dallas was changing fast. A line of violent thunderstorms was forming just north of the airport. The system was unstable, unpredictable, and deadly. At 5:45 p.m. local time, the crew of Flight 191 began their descent toward Dallas-Fort Worth. From their cockpit windows, they could see towering clouds and lightning flashing on the horizon. Air traffic control advised them of light rain showers in the area. But the radar screens told a different story. A massive thunderhead lay directly in their path. The TriStar approached from the southeast, cleared for an approach to runway 17L. Captain Connors peered through the rain-smeared windshield, looking for signs of the storm cell. Lightning flickered in the distance. His weather radar displayed a green patch. Moderate rain, but it couldn't show what was inside. A violent downdraft waiting in the clouds ahead. At 6 p.m., the approach seemed normal. The crew discussed visibility and glide slope. Below them, the Dallas suburbs were dark and hazy under storm clouds. Then, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated a rolling curtain of rain, the leading edge of a microburst. A microburst is one of aviation's most dangerous phenomena. A powerful, localized downdraft of air that slams downward from a thunderstorm, hitting the ground and spreading outward like an invisible bomb. For aircraft on approach, it can mean instant disaster. At 6:03 p.m., Delta 191 entered the storm cell. Within seconds, the cockpit went from calm to chaos. Rain lashed the windshield, wipers struggling to keep up. The TriStar's radar altimeter screamed as altitude dropped. "Lightning ahead," the first officer warned. "I see it," replied the captain. "We're almost through." But they weren't. A powerful gust struck the aircraft from the front, a headwind that suddenly increased the plane's lift. The TriStar began to climb unintentionally. The captain tried to correct. Then, almost instantly, the wind reversed direction, the signature of a microburst. The tailwind hit and lift vanished. In the cabin, passengers felt the drop. Drinks spilled, overhead bins rattled. The engines roared as the pilots pushed throttles to maximum. Outside, sheets of rain reduced visibility to near zero. "Push it up." "Push it way up!" Captain Connors shouted. "Go around, go around," the first officer yelled. But the aircraft was already losing altitude at an alarming rate, more than 2,500 feet per minute. The TriStar's warning system blared, "Whoop, whoop, pull up." At 6:04 p.m., the jet burst out of the cloud base at just 400 feet above the ground. Directly ahead was an open field, and beyond it, a 4-lane highway. The L-1011's main gear clipped a car on the road, killing the driver instantly. The left engine struck a water tank, tearing the wing apart. The aircraft slammed into the ground, disintegrating in a massive fireball. Flames and debris spread across the field and into 2 water reservoirs near the airport perimeter. Fire crews from the airport rushed to the scene within minutes, battling a wall of burning jet fuel under torrential rain. Some survivors were pulled from the wreckage, dazed, burned, covered in mud. One flight attendant, Mary Fortunato, was found alive, still strapped to her seat. Of the 163 people on board, 27 survived. Among them was a 2-year-old boy, found by rescuers lying in the grass, miraculously alive. His mother and father, both seated beside him, were gone. When dawn broke the next day, the wreckage of Delta 191 lay scattered across a field north of the airport, twisted metal and charred earth marking the TriStar's final path. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived, stepping carefully among debris still smoldering from the night's rain. At first, they suspected wind shear, but the evidence told an even clearer story. The cockpit voice recorder captured the final seconds. Confusion, alarms, and the sound of engines straining against the wind. Meteorologists analyzed radar data and weather reports. They found that the storm over Dallas contained an extreme microburst, a violent downflow of air exceeding 60 miles per hour. The TriStar had flown directly into it during final approach. It was a deadly chain of circumstances. A storm cell forming over the airport, radar unable to fully detect the microburst, and a crew believing they could safely continue the approach. In reality, they never had a chance. The NTSB report confirmed the cause: loss of control due to encounter with a microburst-induced wind shear. But it also pointed to deeper issues. Air traffic controllers had not warned the crew of the full severity of the storm. Weather radar systems of the time lacked resolution to detect microbursts clearly. The tragedy of Delta 191 forced aviation to change. The U.S. Federal Aviation Administration launched an aggressive new program to understand and detect wind shear. Doppler radar became standard at airports across the country. Pilots were trained to recognize microburst warning signs and perform go-around maneuvers early. Years later, those lessons saved countless lives. What happened on that stormy Texas evening reshaped how airlines approach weather forever. For the families of those lost, the pain never faded. Many gathered at the crash site each August to remember their loved ones, standing by a small memorial near the field where the TriStar fell. On its plaque, the names of 136 passengers and 11 crew are engraved. Beneath it, the words, "Their sacrifice led to safer skies." Today, pilots flying into Dallas often glance toward that field as they descend through summer rain. Few passengers realize that beneath those green plains lies the site of one of aviation's most important lessons, where tragedy gave birth to change. Delta Airlines Flight 191 remains a haunting reminder of how quickly nature can overpower even the most advanced machines. In the final moments, Captain Connors and his crew fought with everything they had, trusting their instruments, their training, their instincts. But in the invisible war between air and wind, they never stood a chance. As the storm cleared that evening, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light over the smoking wreckage. For a moment, the golden light touched the twisted remains of the TriStar's wings, a quiet, almost peaceful image after the chaos. For those who saw it, the sight would never fade. It was a bright summer afternoon in Southern California, August 31st, 1986. The skies over Los Angeles shimmered with heat. Airliners crisscrossed the sky every few minutes, part of one of the busiest airspaces in the world. To anyone watching from below, it looked perfectly normal, but within minutes, two airplanes would collide in midair, raining fire and wreckage onto a quiet suburban neighborhood. Aeroflot Flight 498. A McDonnell Douglas DC-9 was flying from Mexico City to Los Angeles, with 58 passengers and 6 crew on board. After a brief stop in Tijuana, the flight continued north for its final leg, a short hop across the border into LAX. The captain, Antonio Valdez, was a veteran with thousands of hours of experience. Everything about the flight was routine. At the same time, from a small airfield in Torrance, a private Piper PA-28 Cherokee took off. On board were pilot William Kramer, his wife Kathleen, and their teenage daughter. They were on a simple weekend trip, flying home to Big Bear Lake after visiting friends in the Los Angeles area. The sky was clear. The Cherokee climbed to 6,500 feet, heading northeast. Above them, dozens of commercial flights were descending into Los Angeles International, each precisely following approach corridors through controlled airspace. The difference between order and chaos in this system was measured in seconds and feet. At 11:46 a.m., Aeromexico 498 was cleared to descend through 7,000 feet as it began its approach from the south. The DC-9 was just 20 miles from landing, its passengers gazing out over the city below, the beaches of Santa Monica, the rows of palm trees, the shimmer of the Pacific. Flight attendants began collecting cups and trays as the aircraft leveled off. But the Cherokee had unknowingly entered the same controlled airspace, without clearance, without radar contact, and without realizing the danger. The pilot flying visually had misread his chart. He had wandered into the descending path of commercial airliners heading to LAX. In the radar room at Los Angeles Center, controllers tracked dozens of aircraft, their screens alive with blips of light. But the small Piper was not equipped with a transponder capable of showing altitude. It appeared as a faint target among many, nearly invisible against the clutter. At 11:51 a.m., both aircraft were on a collision course. The Aeromexico DC-9 was descending through 6,500 feet. The Piper was climbing through the same altitude. Neither pilot saw the other until it was far too late. Inside the DC-9's cockpit, Captain Valdez and his first officer were focused on approach procedures. They never saw the small single-engine plane below. At 11:52 a.m., in a bright flash of sunlight over the suburb of Cerritos, the two aircraft collided. The Piper's nose struck the underside of the DC-9's left horizontal stabilizer, slicing it clean off. The smaller plane disintegrated instantly, killing all 3 occupants. The DC-9 lurched violently upward, its tail shredded. In the cabin, passengers screamed as the aircraft pitched nose down uncontrollably. For 12 terrible seconds, the crippled jet plunged toward the ground. Witnesses on the streets below heard the roar of engines followed by a massive explosion. The DC-9 slammed into a residential neighborhood in Cerritos, destroying 11 homes and igniting a firestorm that engulfed the block. Flames tore through houses as thick black smoke rose thousands of feet into the air. Within minutes, firefighters arrived to face a nightmare. Burning wreckage was scattered across lawns and rooftops. Pieces of the DC-9's fuselage lay embedded in homes, its wings shattered. The heat was intense. Firefighters later described it as a furnace of jet fuel and wood. There were no survivors on board either aircraft. On the ground, 15 residents were killed, families caught in their own homes as the wreckage fell from the sky. In total, 82 lives were lost. The neighborhood that morning had been ordinary. Children playing, sprinklers running, families getting ready for church. Within moments, it became a scene of horror. Cars melted in driveways, trees burned black, and twisted metal lay among the ruins of homes. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived within hours. What they found was shocking in its simplicity. A small mistake, a missed communication, and a system not yet equipped to prevent it. Radar data showed that the Piper had entered the terminal control area, restricted airspace requiring clearance, without permission. The pilot likely didn't realize he had crossed the boundary. He was flying under visual flight rules, relying on maps and sightlines, unaware that jetliners were descending through the same altitude above him. The Aeromexico crew had no chance. At that time, commercial airliners did not carry onboard collision avoidance systems. They relied entirely on air traffic control and on radar that couldn't always detect small private aircraft without proper equipment. In the days following the crash, public outrage spread quickly. The image of a flaming airliner in a suburban street shocked the world. Television crews broadcast live from Cerritos, the blackened shells of homes, the broken wings lying across rooftops, the twisted fuselage still smoldering under the California sun. At a local park, families of the victims gathered to lay flowers. Reporters captured the silence, people holding hands, staring at the smoke in the distance. One firefighter broke down in tears on camera, saying, "It was like the sky just opened up and dropped hell on this place." The NTSB's investigation led to a turning point in aviation safety. Their final report concluded that the probable cause was the Piper pilot's unauthorized entry into controlled airspace, combined with limitations in air traffic control radar and lack of collision avoidance equipment. But this tragedy would bring change. The FAA accelerated plans to require Mode C transponders on all aircraft operating near major airports, devices that transmit altitude information to controllers. Even more importantly, the industry began developing an onboard warning system that would forever change air safety. TCAS, the Traffic Collision Avoidance System. TCAS would allow aircraft to detect and avoid each other independently of ground radar, issuing audible alerts to pilots when another aircraft came dangerously close. The system was directly born from the Cerritos disaster. In the years that followed, TCAS became mandatory worldwide for commercial jets. Since its introduction, mid-air collisions between airliners have virtually disappeared. The lessons written in the smoke above Cerritos saved countless lives, but for those who lived there, the memories never faded. The neighborhood was rebuilt, but its scars remained. Survivors described the day as a noise that never ended, like the sky was falling apart. Today, a memorial stands in Cerritos, surrounded by trees and flowers. The names of all 82 victims, passengers, crew, and residents, are engraved on polished stone. At its center, a sculpture of doves takes flight, symbolizing peace rising from tragedy. Each August, families still gather there, some from Mexico, some from California, to remember those lost. Children of the victims, now adults, speak of how the disaster changed their lives forever. The crash of Aeromexico Flight 498 remains one of the most haunting accidents in aviation history, not only for the horror of the impact, but for where it happened, in the heart of a quiet American neighborhood, beneath clear blue skies, on a Sunday morning. It was a collision no one saw coming, a tragedy that revealed the fragile complexity of modern air travel. Two aircraft, two different worlds, one a sleek commercial jet, the other a family's weekend plane, met in the sky by chance, forever linked in history. And as modern jets now soar safely above Los Angeles, guided by radar, satellites, and collision avoidance technology, they pass over Cerritos, over the very place where decades ago a clear sky turned to fire.